On his deathbed, frail and riddled with guilt, 82-year-old Gerald Manning summoned his estranged grandson, Ethan. Whispering with a trembling voice, Gerald confessed a haunting secret. 50 years ago, he witnessed a gruesome murder in the woods near his hometown. The victim's cries still echoed in his mind, but fear kept him silent. "I saw it all," he rasped. "I know who did it, and now, you must uncover the truth before it dies with me." Ethan, stunned, realized this secret could destroy lives, or save them. Gerald Manning lay in a dimly lit hospital room, his face pale and gaunt, skin stretched thin over fragile bones. The rhythmic beep of the monitor marked the slow decline of his heartbeat. Beside him, his estranged grandson, Ethan Manning, sat stiffly in a plastic chair, unsure why he had come after years of silence between them. The smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the machines keeping Gerald tethered to life. "Ethan!" Gerald rasped, his voice barely audible. Ethan leaned closer, straining to hear. "I'm dying," Gerald continued, his words dragging with effort. "But there's something I need to say, something I've kept inside for 50 years. Ethan's brow furrowed. He had spent most of his life resenting this man, the aloof figure who had been absent for much of his childhood. His grandfather was a mystery wrapped in decades of silence, a shadow in family photographs who barely spoke when present. Yet here he was, summoned by a nurse's call claiming his grandfather's last wish was to see him. He almost didn't come. "I don't know what you expect me to do with that information," Ethan said, his tone clipped. 50 years is a long time to bury something." Gerald coughed weakly, his hand trembling as it reached for the drawer of the bedside table. Ethan hesitated before helping him pull it open. From within, Gerald retrieved a small, time-worn pocket watch. Its surface was scratched, the glass cracked. When Gerald pressed it into Ethan's palm, he felt a strange chill, as though the object carried some lingering shadow of the past. This watch," Gerald said, his breathing labored. "I kept it all these years. It belonged to her." "Her?" Ethan asked, confused. He turned the watch over in his hands, noticing a faint engraving on the back, MT 1973. "Margaret," Gerald whispered. "The girl in the woods." Ethan's stomach tightened. He had heard stories of a young woman named Margaret Taylor who went missing decades ago in the small town where his grandfather lived. Her case was never solved, though rumors persisted about foul play. But what did his grandfather have to do with it? "I saw it," Gerald said, his voice cracking. "I saw her die. I saw who did it." Ethan's breath hitched. The room seemed to close in around him, the sound of the monitor fading to the background. "You what?" he asked, his voice rising. "I was there," Gerald admitted, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was in the woods that night. I saw him kill her, and I said nothing." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "You're telling me you witnessed a murder and stayed silent? For 50 years?" Gerald nodded weakly, his expression a mixture of shame and anguish. "I was scared, Ethan. Scared of what they would do to me, to my family. He was a powerful man, a man who could ruin lives." "Who?" Ethan demanded. "Who did this?" Gerald's lips trembled, but no words came out. His breathing grew shallower, the monitor's beeping becoming more erratic. "Grandpa, stay with me," Ethan pleaded, his earlier resentment replaced with urgency. "You can't leave me with half a story. Tell me who did it." Gerald's hand clutched Ethan's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "The watch. It's the key," he managed to say before a violent coughing fit racked his body. Blood speckled the corner of his lips. Nurses rushed in, pushing Ethan aside as alarms blared. He stood frozen, clutching the pocket watch, his mind racing. Gerald's words replayed in his head. "I saw her die. I saw who did it." Minutes later, a doctor emerged, her expression grim. "I'm sorry," she said. "He's gone." Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions: grief, anger, confusion. He looked down at the pocket watch, its hands frozen at 11:13. Was this the time of Margaret's death? What secrets did this watch hold? But something gnawed at him. Why now? Why wait until the brink of death to share such a burden? Ethan's memories of his grandfather were fractured at best, fleeting moments of warmth, overshadowed by a coldness that Ethan never understood. Had this secret been the reason? After leaving the hospital, Ethan drove aimlessly through the city's streets, the pocket watch burning a hole in his jacket pocket. Every few minutes his mind replayed Gerald's final moments, the desperation in his voice, the raw terror in his eyes. Whatever had happened in those woods 50 years ago, it had haunted Gerald every day since. His car eventually came to a stop in the driveway of his apartment. Inside, he placed the watch on the kitchen table and stared at it for what felt like hours. It was just an object, yet it seemed to carry the weight of decades. The engraving on the back, MT 1973, was the only tangible clue he had. Margaret Taylor, 1973. The girl in the woods. Ethan pulled out his laptop and began searching for information about Margaret's disappearance. Most of the details were vague, obscured by time and the sensationalism of small-town rumors. Margaret had been 22 years old, the daughter of a local shopkeeper. She disappeared one summer evening after a party at the town square. Her body was never found, and no arrests were ever made. The case had become little more than a ghost story, whispered among townsfolk to scare children. Determined to find answers, Ethan decided to travel to his grandfather's hometown. He didn't know what he would uncover, but one thing was certain. Gerald's confession had set something in motion, something that could no longer be ignored. As he packed a bag, the weight of the pocket watch in his hand felt heavier than ever. It was more than just an object. It was a burden, a legacy of guilt and silence that now rested squarely on his shoulders. Ethan Manning pulled into the small weathered town of Brookhaven just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Shadows stretched long over cracked sidewalks, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. It was the kind of town where time seemed to stand still, where memories were etched into every creaking porch and peeling street sign. Brookhaven hadn't changed much since Ethan last visited as a child, but now the familiarity felt unsettling. The pocket watch rested in his jacket pocket, a constant, heavy reminder of why he was here. Gerald's cryptic words echoed in his mind. "I saw her die. I saw who did it." The watch, engraved with Margaret Taylor's initials, felt like a key to an invisible door he was about to unlock. But as he stepped out of his car and looked around the sleepy town, he wondered, was anyone here ready for the truth? Ethan's first stop was the local library. The building was small and unimpressive, its exterior faded from years of neglect, but it was a repository of the town's history. Inside, the smell of old paper hit him like a wave, and he approached the librarian, a gray-haired woman who eyed him curiously. "Excuse me," Ethan began, his voice steady but firm. "I'm looking for information on Margaret Taylor. She went missing in 1973. The librarian's expression darkened and she adjusted her glasses. "You're not the first to ask about her," she said, her voice laced with caution. "But not everyone in this town likes to dredge up the past. It's sensitive." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I just need to see whatever records or newspapers you have on her case." After a moment of hesitation, the librarian led him to a dimly lit archive room at the back of the library. "Take what you need," she said, pointing to a stack of yellowed files and newspaper clippings. "But be careful who you talk to. Not everyone here will appreciate your curiosity." Ethan spent hours sifting through the brittle pages, piecing together Margaret's story. She had been a vibrant young woman, beloved by the community. The daughter of a local shopkeeper, she was last seen at a summer festival held in the town square. Witnesses reported seeing her leave with a man, though accounts varied on his description. Some said he was tall and broad-shouldered, others claimed he wore a hat that obscured his face. Margaret never returned home that night. But it wasn't just Margaret's disappearance that caught Ethan's attention. It was the whispers of a cover-up. Several articles hinted that the investigation had been quietly dropped, despite mounting evidence. One reporter, a man named James Colby, had written scathing pieces about the incompetence, or perhaps corruption, of the local police. But after a few months, even Colby stopped writing about Margaret, and the case faded into obscurity. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If Gerald had been in the woods that night, he might have been the only living witness to what truly happened. But why hadn't he spoken up? Was it fear of the man responsible? Or was there more to the story than Gerald let on? As Ethan packed up the files, he noticed a name that sent a chill down his spine: Harold Kane. The wealthy businessman had been a pillar of the Brookhaven community in the 1970s, known for his philanthropy and influence. But rumors swirled about his darker side, whispers of coercion, threats, and bribes. In one article, a former police officer anonymously suggested that Kane had used his wealth to manipulate the investigation into Margaret's disappearance. The pieces were beginning to fit together. The next morning, Ethan decided to visit the woods where Margaret's scarf had been found. The area, just outside the town limits, was dense with towering pines and thick underbrush. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting an eerie gloom over the forest floor. Ethan parked his car on the shoulder of the road and ventured in, the pocket watch still in his pocket like a talisman. The woods were silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. As Ethan moved deeper, he felt an unsettling sensation, as if the forest itself was watching him. He tried to shake it off, focusing on the task at hand. If Gerald had been here that night, maybe there was something he had seen or left behind. After an hour of searching, Ethan stumbled upon a clearing. The ground here was uneven, the grass sparse and trampled. At the center of the clearing stood an old, rotting tree stump, its surface marred by what looked like deep gouges. Something about the place felt wrong, as if it held the echoes of a long-forgotten violence. Ethan knelt by the stump, running his fingers over the gouges, and noticed something shiny wedged in the wood. He pulled it free and held it up to the light. It was a fragment of metal, tarnished with age but unmistakably part of a blade. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Could this be a remnant of the weapon used to kill Margaret? Or was it something else entirely? Before he could dwell on it further, the sound of snapping branches made him spin around. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. Ethan's heart pounded as the figure stepped closer, revealing a man in his 60s with a weathered face and piercing eyes. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low and gruff. Ethan swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the fragment of metal in Ethan's hand, his expression darkening. "That's nothing but trouble," he said. "And so are you, if you keep digging where you don't belong." Ethan squared his shoulders. "I'm not leaving until I find out what happened to Margaret Taylor." The man sighed, his eyes narrowing. "Then you're walking into a world of hurt, boy. There are people in this town who'll do anything to keep the past buried. You do well to leave before you end up like her." Ethan sat in his car outside the local diner, his mind replaying the man's warning in the woods. The words echoed like a sinister mantra. You do well to leave before you end up like her. But instead of fear, the encounter had only stoked his determination. Whoever that man was, he clearly knew more than he let on. And if someone wanted Ethan to stop digging, it only meant he was getting closer to the truth. The diner was a relic of the 1970s, its neon sign flickering weakly as if it, too, carried the weight of years. Inside, the smell of coffee and grease wafted through the air. Ethan approached the counter where an older woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Linda greeted him with a faint smile. "What can I get you?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Just coffee," Ethan said, sliding into a booth near the window. He pulled out the pocket watch and placed it on the table, turning it over in his hands as he waited. The weight of it seemed to press down on him, a physical reminder of the burden Gerald had passed on. Linda returned with his coffee, glancing at the watch curiously. "That's an antique," she remarked. "Don't see those much anymore." Ethan hesitated before speaking. "It belonged to Margaret Taylor," he said, watching her reaction closely. Linda froze, her hand tightening on the coffee pot. Her eyes darted around the diner as if checking to see who might be listening. "You shouldn't be asking about her," she said quietly, leaning closer. "It's not safe." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Why not? What do you know about her?" Linda sighed, setting the pot down. "I was just a teenager when she disappeared, but everyone in town knew Margaret. She was kind, sweet, too trusting for her own good." "Do you remember anything about the night she went missing?" Ethan pressed. Linda hesitated, glancing at the other customers. "It was at the summer festival. She was with a man, someone none of us recognized. He wasn't from around here, but he dressed sharp, like he had money. They left together, and that was the last anyone saw of her." "Did anyone ever figure out who he was?" Ethan asked. "No," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there were rumors. People said he was connected to Harold Kane, that maybe Kane brought him into town for business. But Kane, he had a way of making problems disappear." The mention of Kane sent a chill down Ethan's spine. The name kept surfacing, like a shadow lurking just out of reach. "Why didn't anyone come forward?" he asked. Linda gave him a sad smile. "This town is small, and Kane was powerful. People knew better than to cross him." She glanced at the watch again, her expression softening. "If that belonged to Margaret, then you're poking a hornet's nest, young man. Be careful." Ethan thanked her and left the diner, his mind racing. If Kane had been involved, it explained why the investigation into Margaret's disappearance had been so lackluster. But who was the man she had left with? And why had Gerald stayed silent for so long? Later that evening, Ethan decided to visit Harold Kane's old estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of town. Though Kane had passed away years ago, the estate remained abandoned, its windows boarded up and its grounds overgrown with weeds. The air around it felt heavy, as though the land itself remembered the secrets it held. Ethan parked his car a short distance away and approached the estate on foot. The gate was rusted and creaked loudly as he pushed it open. He scanned the area, his heart pounding in his chest. The driveway was littered with debris, and the mansion loomed ahead like a decaying monument to a forgotten era. Inside, the air was stale, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the chandeliers like ghostly veils. Ethan moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he hoped the estate might hold some clue about Kane's connection to Margaret. In the study, he found rows of bookshelves and an old desk covered in papers. Most of the documents were mundane, ledgers, business correspondence, but one folder caught his attention. It was marked with the initials MT. Ethan's hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a collection of photographs. The first few photos were of Margaret, smiling and carefree. But as he flipped through them, the images grew darker. One showed her at the summer festival, her expression tense as she stood next to a man whose face was partially obscured. Another depicted her in the woods, her eyes wide with fear. Ethan's stomach turned. Someone had been following her, stalking her. Before he could process what he was seeing, a loud crash echoed through the mansion. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat as he spun around, his flashlight illuminating the doorway. He wasn't alone. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of footsteps growing louder. Ethan backed away, clutching the folder to his chest. The light of his flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Panic surged through him as a figure emerged from the darkness. A man in his 60s, the same one he had seen in the woods. "I warned you," the man growled, his eyes glinting with anger. "You don't belong here." Ethan tried to steady his breathing. "What are you hiding? What do you know about Margaret Taylor?" The man stepped closer, his presence imposing. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said. "This isn't just about her. It's bigger than you think." Ethan's grip tightened on the folder. "Then tell me," he demanded. "What happened to her? And why is Kane's name all over this?" The man hesitated, his expression conflicted. For a moment it seemed as though he might answer, but then he shook his head. "You need to leave, kid, before it's too late." And with that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ethan alone in the suffocating darkness of the mansion. Ethan sat on the edge of his motel bed, the folder of photographs spread out before him. The images were haunting. Margaret Taylor, once so full of life, reduced to fear-filled moments captured by an unknown hand. The final photo, the one showing her in the woods, burned into Ethan's mind. Who had been stalking her? And how was Harold Kane involved? The man in the mansion's cryptic warning rang in his ears. This isn't just about her. It's bigger than you think. Unable to sleep, Ethan decided to do more digging. His laptop rested precariously on his knees as he scoured the internet for anything linking Kane to Margaret's disappearance. Most of the information he found was either vague or buried beneath layers of local folklore. But one detail stood out. A name: Henry Carlisle. Henry had been a close associate of Kane during the 1970s, serving as his personal attorney and fixer. His name appeared in several articles, often in connection with cases that mysteriously went away or witnesses who suddenly recanted their statements. If anyone knew the truth about Kane's dealings, it would be Carlisle. Ethan tracked down an address for Henry, who now lived in a secluded farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Early the next morning, he drove out there, the unease in his chest growing with each mile. The farmhouse was weathered and isolated, surrounded by fields that stretched endlessly into the horizon. A rickety fence lined the property, and a rusted mailbox bore the name Carlisle. Ethan knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the empty landscape. After a few tense moments, the door creaked open, revealing an elderly man with sharp, calculating eyes. Despite his age, Henry Carlisle carried an air of authority, his posture stiff and his gaze piercing. "What do you want?" Henry asked, his voice gravelly. "I need to talk to you about Harold Kane," Ethan said, trying to keep his tone firm, "and Margaret Taylor." At the mention of her name, Henry's expression darkened. He stepped outside, shutting the door behind him. "I don't know what you think you're doing, kid, but digging into this will only get you hurt." Ethan held his ground. "I'm not leaving until I get answers. My grandfather, Gerald Manning, saw what happened to Margaret. He confessed it on his deathbed. Now I need to know the truth." Henry's eyes narrowed. "Gerald should have kept his mouth shut," he muttered. He glanced around nervously as though expecting someone to be watching. "Come with me." He led Ethan around the side of the farmhouse to a small shed. Inside, the air was musty, and the walls were lined with old files and boxes. Henry pulled out a dusty folder labeled 1973 and handed it to Ethan. "This is everything I have," Henry said. Kane was a monster, but he was smart. He knew how to cover his tracks. Margaret, she got caught up in something she didn't understand. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, flipping through the folder. It contained old legal documents, letters, and photographs. One letter, in particular, caught his attention. It was addressed to Kane and signed with the initials R.S. "Margaret overheard something she shouldn't have," Henry explained. "A deal between Kane and a man named Richard Stanton. Stanton was a politician on the rise, and Kane was funding his campaign in exchange for certain favors. Margaret found out and confronted Kane. She thought she could expose him, but Kane had Stanton on his payroll. They couldn't let her talk. Ethan's hands trembled as he read the letter. It detailed a meeting between Kane and Stanton at the summer festival. The same night, Margaret disappeared. "So they killed her," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded grimly. "Kane ordered it, but it was Stanton who carried it out. He strangled her in the woods and left her body there. Kane made sure the investigation went nowhere. Your grandfather, he must have seen it happen." Ethan's stomach churned. Why didn't Gerald say anything? Why did he stay silent for 50 years? Henry sighed. Because Kane threatened him, said he'd destroy his family if he talked, and Gerald believed him. Kane had the power to ruin lives, and he didn't hesitate to use it. Ethan clenched his fists, anger and frustration boiling inside him. So, what now? Stanton is still out there, isn't he? Henry hesitated, then nodded. He's a senator now. Untouchable. But if you have that folder, you have proof of his connection to Kane. It's risky, but if you're smart about it, you might be able to take him down. Before Ethan could respond, the sound of a car engine rumbled in the distance. Henry's expression shifted to one of alarm. "You need to go," he said urgently. "Now." "What's going on?" Ethan asked. "They found you," Henry said, shoving the folder into Ethan's hands. "Go, and don't come back." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He ran to his car and started the engine, his heart pounding as he sped away from the farmhouse. In his rearview mirror, he saw a black SUV pull up to the property. Whoever they weren't here for a friendly visit. As he drove, the weight of the folder in his lap felt heavier than ever. He had the evidence he needed to expose Stanton, but he also knew the danger that came with it. Gerald's silence had been born out of fear, and now Ethan understood why. The people behind this conspiracy were willing to kill to keep their secrets buried. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had a choice to make: continue digging and risk everything, or walk away and let the past stay buried. But as he glanced at the photograph of Margaret in the folder, her eyes filled with terror, he knew he couldn't turn back. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. Ethan barely slept that night. The folder of evidence sat on the motel's worn desk like a time bomb, ticking away the seconds until it would inevitably explode his life. The thought of confronting a powerful senator, Richard Stanton no less, made his hands tremble, but he knew there was no going back. If Gerald had lived with the guilt of silence for decades, Ethan couldn't bring himself to do the same. By dawn, Ethan decided he needed help. He couldn't take on Stanton and his cronies alone. But who could he trust? Brookhaven was a small town, and the corruption that Harold Kane had sown into its foundation likely still lingered. With few options, Ethan thought of James Colby, the journalist who had once written articles exposing Kane's criminal connections. Perhaps Colby would know what to do with the evidence. Tracking Colby down wasn't easy. The journalist had left Brookhaven decades ago after his stories were buried under threats and intimidation. After hours of searching online and making a few phone calls, Ethan found him living 2 towns over, in a modest house on the outskirts of a quiet suburb. The drive there was tense, every black car or truck on the road a potential threat in Ethan's mind. Colby answered the door reluctantly, a wiry man with graying hair and eyes that darted nervously. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "My name is Ethan Manning," Ethan said. "I need your help. It's about Harold Kane and Margaret Taylor." Colby's face darkened, and for a moment Ethan thought he might shut the door in his face. But instead, Colby gestured for him to come inside. The house was cluttered with papers and books, the remnants of a career spent chasing stories that no one wanted to hear. "You shouldn't be here," Colby said as Ethan set the folder down on the coffee table. "I left Brookhaven for a reason. That place is a graveyard for anyone who asks the wrong questions." Ethan opened the folder, revealing the damning photographs and letters. "I don't have a choice," he said. "My grandfather witnessed Margaret's murder. He stayed silent his whole life, but he told me everything before he died. This," he gestured to the folder, "proves that Harold Kane and Richard Stanton were involved. I need your help to expose them." Colby leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the letter signed by Stanton. This could ruin Stanton," he murmured. "But you realize what you're up against, don't you? Stanton isn't just a senator. He's untouchable. He's got people in his pocket who'd bury this faster than you can blink." "I don't care," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Margaret deserves justice. My grandfather spent his life haunted by what he saw, and I'm not going to let Stanton get away with it." Colby sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're brave, kid. I'll give you that. But bravery won't protect you. You'll need more than this folder to take Stanton down. You'll need witnesses, people who can corroborate your story." Ethan thought of Henry Carlisle and the black SUV that had shown up at his farmhouse. "There's someone who might be able to help," he said. "Henry Carlisle. He used to work for Kane. He gave me the folder, but I think he's too scared to go public." Colby frowned. "Carlisle's a coward. He's been living off the grid for years, hiding from the same people you're trying to expose. If he won't talk, you're out of luck." Ethan clenched his fists, frustration boiling inside him. "Then what do I do? How do I bring this to light?" Colby hesitated, then stood and walked to a cabinet. He pulled out a small recorder and handed it to Ethan. "You get him on tape," he said. "If Carlisle won't testify, get him to admit what he knows while you're recording. That way, he doesn't have to show his face, but you'll have his words." Ethan nodded, hope sparking in his chest. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," Colby replied grimly. "If Stanton finds out what you're doing, he won't hesitate to shut you up. Permanently." With the recorder in hand, Ethan drove back toward Brookhaven, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew finding Carlisle again would be risky, especially if the men in the SUV were still looking for him. But he had no choice. Carlisle was the key to exposing Stanton, and Ethan was willing to risk everything to get the truth. As he neared the farmhouse, Ethan noticed the eerie quiet of the surrounding fields. The black SUV was gone, but the farmhouse looked deserted. He parked a short distance away and approached cautiously, the recorder hidden in his jacket pocket. "Henry," he called out, his voice low but urgent. "It's Ethan. I need to talk to you." There was no response, only the rustling of the wind through the tall grass. Ethan stepped inside the shed where Carlisle had shown him the folder, but it was empty. The files and boxes were gone, leaving only a faint, musty smell behind. Panic began to rise in Ethan's chest. Had Carlisle fled? Or had Stanton's men gotten to him first? As he turned to leave, he heard a faint noise, a groan, coming from the direction of the farmhouse. Ethan rushed toward the sound, finding Carlisle slumped against the side of the house, blood staining his shirt. His breathing was shallow, his face pale. "Henry!" Ethan cried, kneeling beside him. "What happened?" Carlisle's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused. They found me," he rasped. "Told me to keep quiet. Or else." Ethan pulled out his phone, dialing for an ambulance, but Carlisle grabbed his arm weakly. No hospital," he said. "They'll find me there." "Henry, I need you to hold on," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "You have to help me take them down." Carlisle coughed, blood flecking his lips. You have the folder," he whispered. "That's all you need. Get it to someone who can do something with it." Tears blurred Ethan's vision as Carlisle's breathing grew weaker. "Don't do this," he pleaded. "I need you." Carlisle managed a faint smile. "You're braver than me," he said. "Don't let them win." With that, his eyes closed and his body went still. Ethan sat there for a moment, the weight of the recorder and the folder pressing down on him. Carlisle was gone, and now the burden of justice fell squarely on Ethan's shoulders. He stood, his resolve hardening. Stanton's reach might be vast, but Ethan had something Stanton didn't: truth, and he was willing to risk everything to make sure the world knew it. Ethan sat in his car outside the courthouse, the folder and recorder resting on the passenger seat like passengers on this perilous journey. He had spent the last 2 days putting the pieces together, contacting journalists and activists who could help him expose Stanton. Each step forward felt like a gamble, and the weight of Gerald's secret pressed heavily on him. Now, he was preparing to do the unthinkable: walk straight into the lion's den. The courthouse bustled with activity as officials and reporters hurried in and out, but Ethan's gaze was fixed on one man, Senator Richard Stanton. Flanked by bodyguards, Stanton walked confidently toward the entrance, his polished appearance masking the darkness that lurked beneath. Ethan clenched the recorder in his pocket, his pulse quickening. This man had escaped justice for 50 years, and Ethan was determined to make sure his reign ended today. Ethan's first stop was the office of Angela Park, an investigative journalist he had contacted earlier. Angela had made a name for herself exposing corruption in high places, and her reputation gave Ethan a glimmer of hope. As he stepped into her cluttered office, Angela looked up from her desk, her sharp eyes scanning him. "You're Ethan Manning?" she asked, motioning for him to sit. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But taking down Stanton, that's not just guts, it's suicide." "I don't care," Ethan said, placing the folder on her desk. "This is everything I have. It's proof that Stanton murdered Margaret Taylor and covered it up with Harold Kane's help. There's even a recording of Henry Carlisle confirming it." Angela opened the folder, her expression shifting from skepticism to grim determination as she scanned the documents. This is damning," she admitted. "But Stanton's not just a politician. He's got the resources to bury this and anyone involved. If we're going to do this, we need to be smart." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked. Angela leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk. "We can't just hand this to the police. They're compromised, especially in Brookhaven. We need to go public, make it impossible for Stanton to silence this. Once the story's out, he won't be able to bury it." The press conference was set for the following morning, held on the courthouse steps. As reporters gathered, Ethan stood with Angela, the folder clutched tightly in his hands. His heart pounded as he stepped up to the microphone, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "My name is Ethan Manning," he began, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. 50 years ago, Margaret Taylor disappeared in Brookhaven. Her case was never solved, but today I'm here to tell you the truth about what happened to her." He laid out the evidence, presenting the letters, photographs, and the recording from Henry Carlisle. Each revelation drew gasps from the crowd, and cameras flashed as reporters scrambled to capture every word. By the time he finished, the air was electric with tension. Angela stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "This is more than a murder case. It's a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of power. Senator Richard Stanton must answer for his crimes, and we're calling on law enforcement to act immediately." That night, as Ethan returned to his motel, the danger became all too real. A black car idled in the parking lot, its occupants watching him with cold, calculating eyes. Ethan's pulse quickened as he entered his room, locking the door behind him. He knew they were Stanton's men, sent to intimidate him. Or worse. The phone rang, breaking the tense silence. Angela's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "Ethan, they've issued a warrant for Stanton's arrest. The FBI is involved now. You did it." Relief washed over Ethan, but it was short-lived. A loud crash outside made him spin around. The black car's occupants were approaching his room, their shadows looming on the thin curtains. "Angela, I've got company," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "Get out of there," Angela urged. "I'll send help, but you need to leave. Now." Ethan grabbed the folder and recorder, stuffing them into his bag. He slipped out the back window just as the motel door burst open. Heart pounding, he ran into the night, the sound of footsteps close behind. The chase ended in the woods where Ethan hid among the trees, his breaths ragged and his body trembling. He clutched the recorder like a lifeline, the weight of his grandfather's secret heavier than ever. But even as fear gripped him, a spark of determination flared. Stanton's empire was crumbling, and Ethan knew he had to see this through. The next morning, news broke that Stanton had been arrested, his empire collapsing under the weight of the evidence. Ethan watched from a distance as reporters swarmed the courthouse, their cameras trained on the disgraced senator. For the first time in 50 years, justice for Margaret Taylor seemed within reach. Ethan returned to Brookhaven one final time, standing at the edge of the woods where it all began. He held the pocket watch in his hand, its cracked surface catching the sunlight. "You can rest now, Margaret," he whispered. "They can't hurt anyone else." As he walked away, the weight that had burdened him for so long began to lift. Gerald's silence had been a prison, but Ethan's courage had broken the chains. The truth had come to light, and with it, a chance for healing.